Unit 1A, Life in the Jim Crow South. What was life like for freed slaves after the Civil War? After the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments had been passed. These are the Civil Rights Amendments. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery. The 14th Amendment defined citizenship as not being based on race, and the 15th Amendment gave African Americans the right to vote according to the Constitution. Some of these rights were really in name only because life in the South was very divided. Black codes were put into place, also known as Jim Crow laws, that demanded whites and blacks be separated. It was very clear that any freed slave living in the South wasn't going to be treated as an equal. Sharecropping was a system of work that developed so landowners could allow former slaves to work. It turns into a basic form of re-enslavement that gave freed blacks very little options for progress. Very common in the Jim Crow South was the KKK. The Ku Klux Klan was formed in 1866, and its sole purpose was to intimidate freed blacks and any white people who were perhaps carpetbaggers, anyone that supported equality or rights for freed blacks. They rode around at night in white sheets, burning crosses, threatening people, issuing threats, terrorizing the newly freed slaves. Throughout the South, the black vote was repressed. Though in the 15th Amendment, blacks were given the right to vote, there were various ways different states chose to limit the rights of new freedmen. One way was a plan like the Mississippi plan. It had residence requirements for voting. You had to live in a certain neighborhood. Disqualified voters based on certain crimes. There were crimes like vagrancy that disproportionately affected freedmen. Those crimes were disqualifying. Poll taxes, where you had to pay to be able to vote. And finally, things as absurd as the grandfather clause. In other words, you could only vote if your grandfather had. Well, no freed slave had ever had a grandfather that was able to vote. So it was always very unlikely that these slaves were going to be able to vote. An example of this absurd and very harsh way of governing can be found here. Benjamin Tillman, who was a supremacist governor in South Carolina, said he organized voters and put old families out of business. We became and are the rulers of the state. To ensure his election, he guaranteed there was going to be an elimination of the black vote. And he said, "We have done our level best to prevent blacks from voting. We stuffed ballot boxes, we shot them, and we are not ashamed of it." Consider this quote: "Such ugly incidents reveal a harsh truth. The death of slavery did not mean the birth of true freedom for many African Americans." There were often times that segregation was viewed as right, but most of all, people, even that believed it was wrong, were fearful to stand up against it because it was just how it was done, and the violence of the KKK and other Jim Crow supporters. Consider the absurdity of this story. There was a man in a Mississippi church who was a freedman. He was cleaning, and a white deacon walked in and saw him, and he said, "What are you doing here?" "Boy, what are you doing there? Don't you know this is a white church?" The black man replied, "Boss, I'm here to mop the floor." The white man paused and said, "Well, that's all right then, but don't let me catch you praying." The incredulity of a white man telling a black man, "You can clean the floors in this church, but you are not allowed to pray here," just illustrates how committed segregationists were to maintaining this line. In 1896, the Supreme Court upheld segregation as legal in a Supreme Court decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, that will exist well into the 1950s. That meant that schools, buses, public places were going to be divided along racial lines. So to recap, what was life like for free blacks in the Jim Crow South? it wasn't that different from slavery. It was a very difficult life. Things were very racially segregated. And just because slavery was over did not mean that free blacks in the South were going to experience equality for years to come.